Hello and welcome to the March 2026 edition of Outline, DLA Piper's regular planning law update series. My name is Trevor Ivory. I'm a partner in the planning team. I'm joined today by my colleague Ian Graves, legal director of the team. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Trevor. Hi, everyone.
Today we are running through the highlights, inverted commas, of the Planning and Infrastructure Act, which received Royal Assent a short time ago. So we thought it was a good time just to look at some of the more interesting aspects of the legislation, which is quite far-ranging, I think it's fair to say. As usual, we will look to keep us within 45 minutes to an hour, definitely no longer than an hour, so that we don't hold people up with their days. Please do ask questions if you have any, and you're watching the live version of this, just use the Q&A function on Zoom. And as ever, we'll upload a recording of this to our YouTube channel in the next couple of days for you to watch again if you've enjoyed it that much, or to watch for the first time if you've missed the live broadcast. The purpose, sort of perhaps just starting with the purpose of the Act, as ever, it was much heralded by central government. I think it was described as the most radical reforms for a generation, just like every other set of planning reforms we've had in the last generation or so. And the purpose really was to streamline and speed up both the delivery of new critical infrastructure projects and also the government's aspiration for 1.5 million homes by 2029. So I suppose the question we're going to have to answer today is it going to do any of that? And I know we had obviously some discussions before today, and when we were first settling on this as a topic, you might remember, Ian, we had a conversation and a bit of a debate around whether these were the most significant reforms for a generation, which I think is what government press release described it, wasn't it? Whether they really were that significant. So we'll perhaps put a pin in that and reflect at the end of this session as to whether we think they were significant or not.
It was interesting. It was interesting, wasn't it? Because I think we had slightly different views. I mean, obviously, my practice is mainly in infrastructure planning these days, and whereas you're more on the sort of Town and Country Planning Act side of things, aren't you? And I think spoiler, I think there might be a difference between the impact on those two areas of planning. So, but we can come back to that later.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference, and it's probably worth we ought to share with the audience. You were of the view these were significant. I was of the view when we were talking that they were perhaps underwhelming. But so there's a spoiler there. But let's see if we can persuade each other to the opposite view as we go through. But should we start with the infrastructure changes first, largely because they're first in the Act, aren't they? That's where the Act begins. And I guess kind of initially changes to the pre-application process, the beginning of the process, which always strikes me as very tortuous at the moment. But there are some reforms there, aren't there?
That's right. And I mean, the government put a lot of emphasis in the preparation for the bill on its plans to speed up infrastructure consenting in particular. Obviously, housing has had a lot of focus as well. But I mean, one of the government's aims when it was elected, it said, is to speed up the decision-making process for nationally significant infrastructure projects. So, I mean, looking at the pre-application process, the most significant change, I mean, I think this is significant as an infrastructure practitioner and for clients who are promoting infrastructure developments, is in relation to the pre-application consultation requirements. So currently there is a statutory requirement to consult specified persons, bodies, the local community. And the significance of that is that in order for your DCO application to be accepted by the planning inspectorate for examination, you must have met those statutory requirements. What the Act does when these provisions come into force is to remove that obligation, and it's going to be replaced by a duty to have regard to best practice guidance issued by the Secretary of State. So that is a significant change because for applicants, firstly, the consultation requirements themselves are quite onerous. But secondly, as a procedural requirement, it is quite significant because acceptance risk as a DCO applicant is a very significant risk, and something that always we have to bear in mind. And so what I'm hoping is that this will move the requirement for consultation from a sort of process-driven kind of thing into something that is more about the substance and the effectiveness of consultation, rather than a sort of a box-ticking exercise, if you like.
And I can see that is potentially very helpful, because one of the beauties of the DCO process is you've got the statutory timetable for determination, but that's always seemed to me to be slightly undermined by the significant amount of time that is taken, therefore, front loading the process, and consultation is a big part of that pre-application process at the moment. So I can see that removing that does potentially make quite a difference, not to the statutory period for determination, but the overall sort of start to finish of a DCO process is clearly quicker. But I suppose it depends on what best practice means in terms of consultation. Is there a danger that best practice just means keep doing what we've always been doing under the statute already?
Yeah, I think there is that. I mean, obviously, we don't know what the guidance will look like yet. I mean, there has been some consultation on it, but I mean, I assume that when the government produces draft guidance, it will consult on it. So we'll have an opportunity to see what sort of principles are in that guidance. So to a certain extent, it's difficult at this stage to judge exactly what the impact will be. But I mean, in terms of the process, I mean, just to give an example of why this might be helpful, one of the categories of people that need to be consulted under the Act currently are what's known as Category 3 persons. And anyone who's promoted a DCO will have a shiver go down their spine when I say Category 3 person. So this is effectively a person who, although they're not having any land acquired, might have a claim for compensation as a result of the scheme being built. And it can be quite difficult to identify those sort of people. There isn't any sort of hard and fast rule, and what often happens is that you're sort of, because of the acceptance risk that I talked about earlier on, you're forced into being quite conservative in the way that you identify these people. And what that means is that probably a wider group end up being consulted than necessarily need to be. So removal of that requirement should, remove that sort of procedural issue. But as you say, I mean, the devil's in the detail as always, and it will be interesting to see what the guidance says. I'm hoping that it will be clear about what exactly is expected of applicants, and not be at too high a level, because unfortunately, when you get those sort of guidance documents, what it drives people to do is to go for the lowest risk option, which I think will probably sap a lot of the the good qualities of the reform. I think it's also worth saying, though, Trevor, that the procedural requirements will change. I mean, in reality, I would say almost all DCO promoters, if not all, will still choose to consult. They will do at least some consultation. Now, if you choose to do a consultation, then you have to consult fairly in accordance with the law as it is. So it's not changing necessarily the substance of how we carry out consultation. It is just removing those current procedural requirements. So as I said earlier, I'm hoping that it's going to make consultation more flexible and effective, so that we're focused on the substance of it rather than the process.
Yeah. And your point's a good one to flag, that the devil is in the detail. And with whenever we're talking about legislation, it's one of the challenges of talking about new legislation, isn't it? Is a lot of the detail is to come later in regulations. So it's you kind of speculate to an extent. And the effectiveness of a number of these changes, I think, will depend on how the government chooses to take forward those changes into regulations.
Exactly, and also how quickly those things come forward, because I mean, obviously, for a lot of projects, including some that I'm advising on at the moment, they're in a sort of we're in this kind of phony war period where we've got to progress our application. The current requirements still exist, until those relevant bits of the Act are brought into force. But it might be that by the time our application goes in, the requirement for Section 42 consultation, for example, has been removed. So it's a bit unsatisfactory, really. It would have been better, I think, if those reforms had come into force straight away, and that the guidance was ready to go. But hopefully, it won't be too long before we have sight of those.
Fingers crossed. One of the challenges I've always thought with the DCO regime is you've got thresholds that trigger the requirement for a DCO. Energy projects traditionally above 50 megawatts, although that's changed for solar now, hasn't it? But anything above that, you have to go down the DCO route. And that's sort of, whenever you have a threshold, wherever you set it, you create a sort of unfortunate arbitrary decision-making process at the sort of edges of that threshold, don't you? And I think one of the sensible changes for me in the DCO regime is the ability for the Secretary of State to disapply the requirement for DCO, even if you're above the thresholds that would ordinarily require it, if another consenting regime, presumably in most cases the 1990 Act, is the right way to consent a project. I think that feels to me quite significant.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I've been calling this reverse Section 35. So there is an opportunity to elect to pursue a DCO application in certain circumstances currently. And there have been a lot of changes actually since the Act came into force in I think 2010 to the way that operates. And the government has consistently throughout that period said that it wants developers to have flexibility in terms of the consenting route. And this sort of completes the circle on that, I think, because there are. I mean, you raised the example there of solar farms, and obviously we've increased the threshold there from 50 megawatts to 100 megawatts, but there is still a cliff edge, and 100 megawatts still isn't huge from a generating perspective. And a lot of the same considerations would apply to, say, a 125 megawatt solar farm as would to a 99 megawatt solar farm in terms of appropriateness of consenting route. So, I think that flexibility is going to be huge for developers, because, of course, not everyone needs all the powers and the benefits that the 2008 Act route offers. If you don't need powers of compulsory acquisition, for example, if you haven't got lots of other consents that you need to roll into a one-stop shop, then some of the issues around the more sort of onerous and front-loaded nature of the DCO process might make it unattractive for you.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, isn't it? There are lots of benefits to the DCO regime. If you want CPO or other powers at the same time, you have the ability to roll all of that together. Even if you're a private developer, you can have access to compulsory purchase powers. All of that is great, but it does come at a cost, and actually a significant time. Although it's a more certain time process, it's not necessarily quicker than the 1990 Act. And so the ability, when you don't need those extra powers, to make the choice to go back to the 1990 Act, I think is really important. And one area that's very close to my heart and to my practice, where I think this is going to be useful moving forward, is in data center development. We're seeing a lot of data centers come forward. They're dealt with under the 1990 Act, but increasingly, because of the problem of getting power from the grid, a lot of my clients are looking at on-site generation as a solution to early delivery of a data center when you can't get the power requirements you need from the grid, or can't get them potentially for 10 or more years. The difficulty there is, if you start talking about on-site generation, you're at risk. Data centers, a relatively modest data center is 100 megawatts plus these days. you're risking the generation tripping the data center project into a DCO, and so that seems to me a good example of the sort of that flexibility potentially being right, because a data center doesn't need the other powers. It tends to be quite a contained site. You don't need those land acquisition powers. You don't need the other things. So actually being able to say, well, notwithstanding that I've got significant generation, I still want to go down the 1990 Act route. I can see for that, just as an example sector, is actually quite useful, because a number of my clients have up to now been reluctant to look at on-site generation because of the delay that would result in terms of getting through the planning process and riding the wave that there clearly is at the moment of significant demand for data centres. You want early delivery if you can possibly achieve it. So that feels to me like a really useful power to be able to sort of step out of the regime in the right circumstances.
Yeah, agreed.
And it probably, although I'm going to go slightly off topic here for a minute and go back to the last most significant reforms of the planning system for generation, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, the LURA to its friends, it's probably just worth noting one of the changes that was legislated for there is now in force as of the back of last year, which is this ability for data centres to be included in the DCO regime. It's almost the reverse of what we've just been talking about. Up until now, Section 35 of the Planning Act has allowed certain projects to become DCOs rather than have to go through the planning process, but data centres hasn't been included in that list. That now the changes are in force, and so if you're a data centre operator and you want to be in the DCO regime, if you need those land acquisition powers or if there are other reasons, then that is now open to you as well. So I suppose it sort of felt odd to not just mention that as a data center operator. Now you can choose to be in the regime, or if you're generating but still don't want to be in the regime, you can choose to be out. So you're almost doing the okey dokey there as to whether you're in or out of the process. But that I think is genuinely quite helpful for data centers, that they now have that flexibility as to which process they want to use, almost sort of regardless of the configuration of your particular project.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's what we want is now. We want applicants to be able to choose and make a judgment as to what is best for their scheme. I mean, I think that I think there are a couple of things that will be interesting to keep an eye on in relation to this. I mean, obviously, the data center, the size of data centers has been growing, and I think will certainly grow in the future. So, I mean, it may be that some of the advantages offered by DCOs will become more significant over the next few years. I mean, one thing is, if the government's objectives in terms of speeding up the infrastructure planning process, if the government achieves those objectives by the reforms in the Act, I mean, it may be that it's much closer between the planning system and the DCO system. Going forward, because one of the main advantages, I think, from the perspective of applicants, is that often it is a bit quicker to go through the regular planning system. But I think the other thing to keep an eye on as well, if you look in the US, for example, data center development has actually become very locally controversial in a lot of places. I think partly because of perceived environmental consequences. So there's been a lot of discussion of the water requirements, water consumption requirements, for example, but also, and this is a bit of a quirk, I think, of the way that the US electricity grid works versus here. I think there's been concerns that local data center development will make electricity more expensive or more scarce in certain areas. So in the US, we've started seeing local government there, restricting data center development, for example. Now, if you had the same sort of local concerns in the UK, I mean, it might actually be more attractive for developers to go through the DCO route, obviously, because it means that the decision is being made at a national level and not a local level. So, we'll see how that develops. But I mean, I could see that over the next few years, particularly as the power requirements for data centers grow.
You're spot on there, and of course we do see it. Go to Buckinghamshire and look at data centre development in the Green Belt. It's already locally controversial in a number of cases. so yes, that's one of the advantages of DCOs is you're bypassing it. I think at the moment the appeals system is functioning well. Inquiries, you almost, if you're going down the inquiry route, getting a decision within 6 months of submitting your appeal. And there is a lot of central government support increasingly coming through planning policies, changes to the MPPF, etc. There's a lot of support. So you at the moment, even if you know you're going to get a recalcitrant local authority, you still know you can get through the appeals process in under 6 months, about 6 months at the moment, which is quicker than a DCO. But that will change. The appeals system, we know, gets blocked up when we go for planning by appeal, which seems to be the only way we ever deliver anything in this country. Then the appeals system becomes overloaded and the appeals become a more long-winded process, at which point the DCO definitely makes it. So there are lots of situations, I think, where DCO is the answer. But the point, I think, for data centres now is thanks to the changes to Section 35 and the reverse Section 35, as you describe it, they've got that choice now. They've got quite a lot of control over which route. So you can, for each project, you can really think about what the right answer is for the project that you've got. We ought to move on. You get sidetracked by data centres. As soon as I talk about data centres, I get caught up. Should we move on and look at some of the planning changes? So the 1990 Act, traditional planning route, and look at the changes there. And here it's kind of there are probably lots of small changes that we just need to sort of canter through in the time we've got available. One of them, the very first one in the legislation, is changes to fees for planning applications, and I think this is potentially quite significant in terms of the fact that it's potentially quite expensive for clients. At the moment, we have nationally set planning fees, and that is going to be replaced. Local authorities will have the power to set their own planning fees at a local level, with a cap at the cost of delivery of the service. So they can't make a profit out of the fees they charge, but they can look to effectively make certain parts of the planning function that they have effectively cost neutral. And I think it's sort of worth just thinking about that a little bit. So the whole determination of an application process, development control, is part of what can be covered by the new fee. Enforcement, plan making are excluded, so you're not going to have to cover those costs. But I think the bit for me that is interesting is the planning authorities are also going to be able to recover the costs of the other departments who provide support on the decision-making process. So whether that's the conservation team, the landscape team, the economic development team, potentially the solicitors in terms of negotiation of 106s and things. There's an interesting point there, given recent appeal decisions about whether you can charge legal fees separate to planning application. So all of that, it seems to me, has the potential to allow planning authorities to look to quite a significant increase in fees that they charge for planning moving forward. And I suppose, on the one hand, the reason behind this is a theory that if you provide more resources to planning authorities, you're going to get faster, presumably better decision making. If that is achieved, then I think a lot of developers would say, well, I'm prepared to pay more for a better service. There's a question for me as to whether throwing money at the problem will actually improve decision making, or whether you're just going to pay more for the same quality of service that you're currently getting. So I think there's an interesting one to watch and just see what local authorities do in terms of looking for fee increases, but also then actually, do we see commensurate improvement in service, or do we just see the same service costing more?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's absolutely no doubt that that fees will increase. If you look at whenever public authorities are given powers to, the option to increase charges, they generally will do, and they generally will do to the maximum extent that they can. I mean, to a certain extent, this is aimed at addressing, isn't it, the real sort of shortfall that planning authorities have faced probably since the early 2010s. So there's an element of catch up in this, I think, isn't it? But I mean, I think you can put your right. I mean, I think from a developer's perspective, you would gladly pay double the application fee for a better service, but there's no express link in the Act between paying extra and getting a better service. So, unfortunately, I'm looking at other areas of public sector. The public sector, often more money doesn't necessarily mean better service. It just means, more expensive. So again, we'll see how this progresses. But I mean, in fairness to local planning authorities, there's no doubt that over the last sort of several years, there's been underfunding of the planning function. So, certainly it should help.
We have already, of course, a planning performance agreement where you can pay more in return for a better service. That remains, so you could end up paying more in your application fee and still looking to enter into a planning performance agreement. I suppose the question for me is, has the existence of a planning performance agreement had an impact in improving the service? If not, it makes me skeptical as to whether the fee increase that everybody's paying. And I'm not sure. I have to say, when I've seen planning performance agreements, we see a lot of them. I'm not sure that overall you get value for money. I think you get a slightly improved service, but it's not really driven up quality or the speed of decision making. For me, I'd have been a bit more radical. I'd have said, actually, I'd have tied it to, if you lose an appeal, then you refund the application fee. So there's actually an incentive to get the decision right and to do it quickly with non-determination appeals as an offering. But we will see. There's
I guess the difference, I suppose, from a local authority perspective with planning performance agreements is that they are voluntary, and it's difficult for local authorities, I guess, to invest in more staff and all those sort of things on something that inherently is not a secure income stream. Whereas if they know that over the next 2 years fees will increase by X percentage, it means that they can actually increase their resources. Because I mean, in fairness, with the planning performance agreements, they don't have any, don't automatically have more resources just because they're being paid more. And I think resourcing is the issue, isn't it, in a lot of cases? So I would hope that it would improve the situation.
Yeah, and yes. So 2 more short points from me. I suppose, firstly, increase in planning application fees will have an impact on viability. So there is a risk if fees go up significantly. If fees go up and affordable housing and other planning gain goes down because of a viability issue. So I think there's a certain element of risk of sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul if you're not careful with that. The other thing, just to add, is alongside the locally set planning fees, one of the other things introduced by the Act is a surcharge on planning fees, which is going to be set centrally by central government as a percentage of the national fee rather than of any local fee. And that is to cover the costs of statutory consultees who are engaging with the planning process. And I think the same sort of thing applies. Okay, in principle, we've all had situations where the statutory consultee is taking too long to respond, they're not engaging constructively in the process. So we would all pay more to get the engagement we need from the statutory consultees. I think it's possibly even less likely that this drives a change in behaviours of the statutory consultees, given that the money doesn't go directly to the statutory consultees, it goes into central government, who then can spend it on those consultees. It feels as if, yes, again, great idea. We need, if you're going to speed up process, you need statutory consultees to work with you on that. But whether an extra cost on the cost of a planning application in order to fund that actually achieves a difference in performance, I am not convinced, but we'll see.
I can tell you're skeptical, Trevor.
I'm sorry. Try and be more positive. I'm not sure I'm going to be on the next one either. The next one I wanted to talk about was training for local councillors before they're allowed to sit on planning committee. I mean, this just effectively there's already a lot of training, but there's now going to be a mandatory statutory requirement for training and a certification process before a councillor can sit on planning committee and make planning decisions. That has to make sense. It can't be a bad thing that we ask those who are going to determine planning applications to have had some training on sort of section 38.6 and what the planning process is and what their role in the process is. So I think must be a good thing. Slight oddity in that whilst there's an obligation that councillors sitting on planning committees must have done this training, if they sit on it without having done the training, the legislation is clear that that isn't a ground for challenging the decision, which strikes me as slightly odd and makes it a little bit toothless. But I think here, and this is where my cynicism picks in, for me, the big issue here is the issue with decision making at local authority level actually about the training that is provided to councillors, or is it actually about the fact that councillors are, and I speak as a former councillor myself, not a member of planning committee, and I always ducked that one, but I have been a councillor. People don't become councillors for fun. They do it because they care. I mean, it's a pretty thankless task, and they do it because they're very passionate about their local communities. But I've never come across a councillor who, when you ask them why they got themselves elected, said, because I'm very keen on carrying out a quasi-judicial function on planning committee. That's not what motivates them. What motivates them is doing what they think is right for their community, doing what their neighbours, their voters want. That's what motivates them. And at the end of the day, I sort of a slightly sneaky suspicion that it doesn't matter how much training you have, if you think that this is the wrong thing for your community, whether that is based on sound planning principles or based on other matters, just think you're always going to be pulled in the direction of doing what you think is right and what ultimately you were elected to do. So I kind of skeptical about whether it worked, but largely because I have a huge amount of respect for councillors and their motivations. I just don't think their motivation is about good planning decision making, and nor should it be. No one's going to win an election based on promising sound planning judgment.
Well, I mean, I was saying to you earlier, wasn't I? It's going back a few years now, but I started my career in local government and advised the planning committee for several years. And I mean, I've actually got a lot of sympathy with councillors in this sort of situation. I mean, there's a tendency to be, to sort of pan councillors, isn't there, for refusals against officer advice and so on. But exactly as you say, I mean, my experience is that generally, councillors are in it for the right reasons. And my experience was always that when you got a new councillor onto the planning committee, they were really excited when they first arrived, because this was exactly the sort of thing that they'd got elected to do, and then really disappointed when they were told that the sort of constraints on their ability to make a decision effectively make it that in most cases they haven't really got much discretion at all. But I mean, this is a bit philosophical, isn't it? But I mean, ultimately, if you put someone who's responding to political incentives into what is supposed to be a non-political, as you say, quasi-judicial role, you can't then be surprised when they act politically, can you? I mean, ultimately, they've got to be responsible to their voters, and the average voter doesn't necessarily understand that when a councillor is in that situation, they're not supposed to just do what what their constituents want. They're performing a different quasi-judicial function. So I think councillors are in a bit of a bind in that sense. But perhaps some of the reforms that we'll go on to talk about in a minute about scheme of delegation might help out with that, because part of the issue I think sometimes is that councillors are being asked to make decisions on applications where the planning committee isn't necessarily the correct decision-making body.
It's a neat segue, so carry on. Next one, delegation.
Well,
scheme of delegation.
The scheme of delegation. So there's a proposal there's a provision which will allow the schemes of delegation across councils to be standardised. So currently, each local authority can decide for itself how it delegates decisions. So it's the council itself that has the powers of the local planning authority, and each council will decide in its constitution how it wants to delegate that decision-making power. So which applications have to go and be decided by the planning committee, which can be decided by professional officers. And so that can be inconsistent between even neighbouring authorities. So, if you're a developer, you could have an application in authority A that is decided by officers, and in authority B it must go to the planning committee. And there are things like a lot of councils' constitutions will have provisions whereby if a local ward councillor, for example, asks for the application to be decided by the planning committee, it has to go to the committee, even if it's not a major development. So the idea is that that those provisions will be standardized. And I think the aim of the legislation here is to make sure that more decisions are made by professional officers, and to try and avoid this situation where, applications are being refused against officer advice. And, we've all seen those applications in our careers. And generally, if there's an appeal, the appeal will be successful. That can have cost consequences for local planning authorities, as well as causing delays for applicants. So, for me, this is a positive change.
I agree with you. I think what that delegation is going to look like is going to come forward in regulations, and we won't know quite what teeth it's got until we see that.
There's a theme here, isn't there?
There is, isn't there? There is always, whenever we talk about legislation, there's always a theme, which is we don't know yet. We don't know, but I think it seems to me at sort of worst in terms of its potential to move the dial. What it's going to do is to not necessarily impact on the applications that those listening to us are likely to be bringing forward, but it will remove, I don't know, next door's extension or conservatory or the minor development that can clog up. And if you look at an agenda for a planning committee meeting, there might be one application on there for 1,500 homes, but it's item number 27, and before that it's extension of a garage and everything else. And half the time you don't get to the 1,500 home application, having sat through hours and hours of stuff, because everybody got very upset about the rendering of next door's garage.
Or the same amount of time is spent on 1,500 homes as is spent on the garage.
Yeah.
And often those come from that call-in power that I was talking about before. It'll be the two local ward councillors. For some reason this is controversial in that street, and so the two local ward councillors have asked for it to be dealt with by the planning committee. That's exactly the sort of thing that should never happen.
It seems at the very least it should get rid of all of those, so that actually item 1 on that agenda can be the 1,500 home planning application. That's really important. You're still going to have all the debates around it. I suppose at best, I'd really like to see. I suspect we won't get anywhere close, but I'd really like to see, if you've got officers' recommendation to approve, and if there are no statutory consultees that are against, and if you're complying with the development plan, let's be bold. Let's say that's not a matter for the planning committee. It won't happen for the political reasons. I think that ultimately, if it's politically controversial, then I think the view will be it still needs to go before elected members. But somewhere between those two extremes is going to be the answer. And it seems to me, if nothing else, even if it doesn't directly impact those bigger, more impactful applications, what it will do is clear the agenda of a committee meeting, so that you can actually spend the time considering those applications and hopefully get to them a bit quicker.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think, for me personally, I think the appropriate level of the planning system for democratic involvement is actually plan making rather than decisions on applications in most cases. And actually, I mean, this was a proposal, obviously, a few years ago. But I mean, to a certain extent, if an application is compliant with the plan, meets the criteria set out in the local plan, there's not really any reason why it should ever be refused, is that, I mean, that in fact it's just the law that it should be approved. So to a certain extent, does it even need an officer to decide? But
That's
it's a discussion for another day.
every now and again, there's probably about 20 years ago, I remember the last time that there was a debate around whether planning authorities should determine planning applications or whether they should just set policy and then have a sort of almost, whether it's magistrates court or a planning and environmental court, sometimes been mooted, but having a non-political determination. That is definitely a topic for another day. We'll be here for hours if we start that now. Very briefly, I'm just going to acknowledge, because I think it's useful but not terribly interesting, one of the provisions in the Act allows for extensions of time for planning permissions, further extensions of time beyond the existing ones, if planning permission is subject to a judicial review or statutory challenge. And I think that's helpful. Anyone who's ever been in that situation, you can spend so much time litigating the point that then you've got no time left to implement the planning permission. So that it's there and it's useful, but I don't think we need to say any more about it.
Often an objective of those who are challenging decisions is to try and run the clock out, isn't it? So exactly as you say, it's an important reform. Yeah.
The last one I wanted to pick up on planning and conscious of time is spatial development strategies. This radical new idea that even outside of London, we need an element of strategic planning sitting above local planning. I say radical and new, but
it's amazing no one thought of this before, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure this used to happen in the form of county structure plans. Then we had the regional plans. Then it all went under localism in 2010. Eric Pickles got rid of it all. And we've been missing it ever since, I think. It seems to me it's perfectly sensible to say there needs to be a greater than local level of planning, a much more strategic approach to planning. So bringing back those spatial development strategies, which are going to be brought forward by the combined authorities or the county planning authorities, various different guises, but effectively a county / combined authority area level of strategic planning, basically putting the rest of England on the same basis as London, which has always had its London plan as well as the borough plans, and both of those together constituting the development plan for the purposes of 38.6. It must make sense, and will potentially, I think one of the advantages of regional planning and strategic planning back in the day was things like housing numbers and how they were allocated between districts and boroughs was made at a sort of less local level, which made it slightly easier for the politicians involved to make those decisions, because they weren't voting for their own Christmas as a turkey, they were voting for another turkey's Christmas. And so I think that's got to be sensible. Ultimately, does it speed up the process? No, it's another plan that needs to be brought forward. But it's got to hopefully lead to better planning policy. You would hope, but probably not for another 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, in the medium term, you would hope that will improve things somewhat, I think. But I mean, the issue here obviously is that those plans don't exist at the moment and need to be developed and adopted. And we all know that isn't necessarily a quick process. So I suspect you might not see the benefits of it in this Parliament, which from the government's perspective probably isn't great.
Yeah. So just I'm conscious of time. We've had a couple of questions come through on the 1990 Act changes stuff. So if we just sort of pause there and pick up on those questions. The first is a question, but it's not really a question. It's a very good point, cunningly disguised as a question, which is coming back to the question of training. And the person asking the question is making the very valid point that there's a risk that requiring members to have been trained potentially leads to delays in certain circumstances. And the example that the questioner gives is if you've had sort of changes in councillors. And I think that has to be right. If you see a huge swing in a local authority, and we're seeing a lot of those at the moment, we may well see more of those in May with the local elections in England, and you see a whole new group of councillors being elected, that will inevitably, it seems to me, if the requirement is to have the certificate before you sit on planning committee, you may find you don't have enough trained councillors. And so you would hope that, particularly in that situation, which seems to me the most likely, is when there's a sort of an election with a potential big swing, you would hope that that's part of the pre-election planning going on moving forward by local authorities is to make sure you've got your training days lined up for very shortly after the election day, so that you can get those new councillors through that process and get them trained in time for your next committee meeting without causing that. But definitely, if it's not planned for.
Really good point. Yeah, really good point. I mean, most councils, I think, probably do already have that requirement that councillors undergo training, actually. But yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I mean, I suppose the fact that decisions won't be invalidated by councillors not having been trained does mean that you could potentially still have your planning committee, but we'll see.
Yeah. The second question is asking me to give the name of the case that I mentioned in connection with Section 106 and legal fees. We will circulate details of it with an email that goes out after this, and we'll put it in we'll put the link in the text that goes with the YouTube edition as well. But it's an appeal decision rather than a court case. It's an appeal that I was involved with for a data centre in Buckinghamshire early last year, I think. Now from memory, I think it's just over a year old. The Court Lane was the site, but I'm not going to pretend that I can give you the very long planning inspectorate appeal reference offhand. We did cover it in an outline session probably about 12 months ago, where we were looking at Section 106 type issues. So it's been covered before, and again we can circulate the link to that with the reference. But it's Court Lane appeal decision from last year, decision of the Secretary of State. In short, to answer the questioner's point, what the Secretary of State found, that you couldn't require payment of legal fees for negotiation of Section 106. It wasn't SIL compliant. There was no statutory power out with SIL regulations and 106 to enable you to do that. Great. Those are the questions that we've had come through on the Planning Act. The last topic that we're not going to deal with CPO. There are changes to CPO, but we tend to pick up CPO changes in en masse. And in fact, we talked about some of them. I talked about some of them with Sophie in a Sophie Kelly in a recent episode of Outline. But actually some of the really interesting stuff is in environmental delivery plans. It's probably worth us just exploring those a little bit in the little bit of time we've got left here. And although I think also there is a whole session of Outline on these once we have the detail of the regulations. I think there is a session on how they work, how they interact with the habitats regulations. But fundamentally, they're designed to try and avoid a recurrence of the situation that we've had in a number of cases. But the one that was affected most people was the nutrient neutrality issues that we've had around large swathes of England, and the challenge of that effectively bringing consenting of particularly residential development to a halt because of quite insurmountable issues for individual developers when you've got an issue that like nutrient neutrality that's causing a problem at a European law level. But there is potentially a sensible way forward in the Act, isn't there, Ian?
There is. And I mean, I think this has probably been the most controversial part of the Act, hasn't it? There's a lot of debate about this. I mean, the idea is that Natural England will prepare environmental delivery plans in suitable cases, and what that will mean is that developers will pay a nature restoration levy. So conceptually, I suppose, a little bit similar to community infrastructure levy. It's the same kind of idea, which will be a standardized payment rather than do their own site-specific investigations and mitigation and so on under the habitats regulations and other related environmental regulation like the Badgers Act and those sort of things. So the idea is that rather than each individual site being obliged to address their obligations under the habitats regs, actually this will be looked at on maybe a district-wide basis. And the first environmental delivery plans that Natural England proposes to develop relate to nutrient neutrality, as you say, and also great crested newts, which are another, sort of common habitats regulations issue. As you say, we did a session on nutrient neutrality on Outline, I think going back maybe 18 months or 2 years ago, perhaps linked to that in the email that goes out following this episode. But I mean, if you're interested in knowing more about that, nothing much has changed since then. So you should still be up to date if you watch that session.
And I think the theory here is a great one. And nutrient neutrality is a good example where the problem is, just the mere building of new house, bringing people on, contributes to the issue of increasing levels of nutrient in local water courses. That you just can't solve that on a site-by-site basis. Ultimately, that is about making sure that you've got adequate sewage treatment plants, making sure that you're not pumping untreated sewage into the water, making sure that the nutrients being taken out in that treatment process. Also, looking at controlling the use of fertilizers in farming and agriculture, which is the biggest source of nutrients entering watercourses. So the problem that we had and still have with nutrient neutrality is, yes, for the purposes of the habitats regs, undoubtedly building a new house contributes to the damage that's being done to these protected sites, but the solution is not within the gift of most developers, certainly not at the smaller scale. And so the idea is saying, well, actually, the solution sits elsewhere. Therefore, we'll be clear what the solution is. Everyone will be required to contribute to the solution, but that will enable consenting of residential development to move forward and allow delivery of housing. That is a fantastic idea. I suppose for the last time, maybe this session, the devil will be in the detail. How quickly is Natural England going to get these plans in place is key. I know nutrient neutrality is one that's being prioritised, as I understand it, within central government. But the next big thing that pops up that we're not expecting, how quickly will Natural England be able to respond to that, work out what the solution is, and get a plan in place in order to minimise that delay? I think that's a big question. Also, fair to say, there's questions there around, some commentators have expressed concerns about whether that represents a watering down of the habitats regulations protections. If it does, there are consequences there in terms of international law, because we're obliged under the various Brexit treaties not to row back from the protections that exist in European environmental legislation. So it feels like there's also potentially some challenges to come, legal challenges to come as we move this forward. But if it can be moved forward, it can be a really, really significant point, which kind of brings us full circle to where we were at the beginning of this, as to, is this really significant or not? And I think you're right, Ian, that in terms of, it depends on your perspective. I think for me, the changes to the planning process rather than the DCO process, planning application process, if we're lucky, they will improve the quality of decision making, they may improve resourcing, but are they really going to shift the dial? Do we really think we get any closer to the 1.5 million target by 2029 because of these changes? I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced, and therefore that's sort of why I probably still sit, with one exception, in the possibly not as significant as central government press releases would have us believe. The one exception to that is those environmental delivery plans. If they work, they can make a significant difference. But have I persuaded?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
or do you still think it is?
I think no. I mean, I think in terms of the Town and Country Planning Act regime, I think you're right. I think effectively what we're doing is sort of fiddling around the edges of the system, aren't we? Really, and I don't think any of those reforms are going to really move the dial. I think you're right about environmental delivery plans as well. If that works, I mean, certainly even if you only took the example of nutrient neutrality, I mean, potentially that does unlock. There must be into the hundreds of thousands of homes currently blocked by that issue. So even if it only solved that issue, then it would have a significant effect. I mean, I think in terms of infrastructure planning, there's no doubt that this is potentially a very significant set of reforms, and I do think actually that there are even there are some that we haven't had time to talk about in this session. But I mean, if you look at the package as a whole, it does respond to a lot of common issues and concerns that applicants had, and consultation feedback that the government will have received. I mean, I advised a couple of clients and helped them with their consultation responses, and some of those issues that they'd raised have actually made their way into the final act. So I do think that that they will have a positive effect in terms of making the system quicker and more effective.
Yeah. So we're probably still in slightly different places on its significance, but we've at least worked out why, which it depends on which bit of planning you're spending most of your time on as to whether it's going to move the dial or not. Well, that's perfectly timed. We always promise to be no more than an hour, and we've got about a minute left before we go over our time. So that's a great place to end. If I can thank everyone for joining us on the live broadcast, thank you particularly for the questions. Ian, thank you for joining me for the discussion today. Outline will be back in May with our next episode, so do watch out for details of that, which we will circulate shortly. And in the meantime, from a for once sunny Birmingham, finally the sun seems to be out. Enjoy the spring. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.